6 kilometers of tunnels snake through the mountain beneath what was once the most powerful concentration of Nazi leadership outside Berlin. In these underground passages, approximately 107 rooms were carved from solid rock by the hands of forced labourers who worked in conditions so brutal that many would not survive to see the war's end. This was the hidden world beneath Hitler's mountain paradise, a subterranean fortress that represented both the paranoia and the megalomania of a regime in its final desperate years, and it stands today as one of the most tangible reminders of the Third Reich's last gasping attempts to maintain power as the Allies closed in from all sides. The transformation of Obersalzberg from Hitler's private mountain retreat into a fortified complex housing the Nazi elite began in earnest in the mid-1930s, under the direction of Martin Bormann, who held the title of Hitler's private secretary, but wielded power that extended far beyond what that modest designation might suggest. As head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, Bormann controlled access to Hitler and managed virtually every aspect of the Führer's personal and professional life. His authority over the Obersalzberg was absolute, and he used that authority with ruthless efficiency to reshape the entire mountainside according to his vision of what a Nazi power centre should be. Bormann's methods were heavy-handed, even by Nazi standards. Local residents who had lived on the Obersalzberg for generations found themselves pressured to sell their properties at prices dictated by the Nazi authorities, and those who resisted faced threats, intimidation, and ultimately forced removal. The process of acquiring land and clearing the Obersalzberg of its original inhabitants was systematic and thorough. Families who had farmed these mountain slopes for decades, who had built homes and established businesses catering to the tourist trade that had flourished since the late 19th century, were systematically dispossessed. Their houses were demolished to make way for new construction, their land seized for the expansion of the Führersberggebiet, the restricted area that would eventually encompass most of the mountain. One particularly telling example was the fate of the Hotel zum Türken, a popular inn where the composer Johannes Brahms had once stayed. The owner, Karl Schuster, a veteran of what he called the Turkish Front during World War I, for which he had named his guest house, refused to sell to the Nazis. His resistance proved futile. He was forcibly removed from the mountain, and his hotel was converted into headquarters for the SS Führerleibwache, Hitler's personal bodyguard. The building would later house SS prison cells in its basement as part of the expanding tunnel network serving as a conduit between Bormann's bunker and Hitler's underground apartments. As other prominent Nazi leaders sought properties near the Berghof, eager to be close to the seat of power and to enjoy the prestige that came with having Hitler as a neighbour, the Obersalzberg rapidly evolved from a quiet farming community and tourist destination into what was essentially a small city dedicated to serving the needs of the Nazi elite. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, built an elaborate villa complete with a swimming pool and an archery range, though the archery equipment seems almost comical given that Göring commanded the most formidable air force in Europe at the time. His house was filled with rare and valuable artifacts collected from across the continent, much of it looted from occupied territories and Jewish families who had been stripped of everything they owned. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later Minister of Armaments, kept a design studio in a nearby valley. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and architect of the Holocaust, and Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, also established residences in the area, creating a concentration of Nazi power that rivaled Berlin itself. The Obersalzberg became a village community housing approximately 2,000 high-ranking Nazis and their families, complete with extensive amenities that would have been unimaginable in most of wartime Germany. There was a bowling alley for recreation, a cider press, a cinema showing the latest films, a model farm that provided fresh produce kindergartens for the children of Nazi officials and staff, and outdoor swimming pools where families could enjoy the mountain summer weather. The complex even maintained its own beehives, producing honey for the tables of the elite. A workers' camp was constructed to house the highly paid Italian labourers who were experts in mountain road building and whose skills were essential for the construction projects Bormann envisioned. These Italian workers represented a privileged class compared to the forced labourers who would later be brought to the Obersalzberg receiving decent wages and relatively humane treatment in exchange for their specialised expertise. The Platterhof, which had begun as a modest hotel catering to middle-class tourists, was massively expanded and converted into what was officially described as a place where ordinary Germans could spend a night near their Führer for just 1 Reichsmark. The reality, however, was quite different from this populist propaganda. The completed structure was so large and luxurious that only high-ranking party officials and honoured guests could realistically afford to stay there. And during the war, it was briefly converted into a military hospital before being requisitioned for other purposes as the conflict ground on. The transformation of the Platterhof exemplified the persistent gap between Nazi propaganda about serving the common people and the reality of privilege and hierarchy that actually characterized the regime. Interestingly, not all structures on the Obersalzberg were directly subordinate to the Nazi leadership or served their immediate interests. According to a US Army report dated May 28, 1945, compiled by the Headquarters 41st Corps Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff and titled Hitler's Mountain Retreat, there was one facility that stood apart from the general pattern of luxury and self-service. The report noted that about the only spot touched by human kindness was a hospital that accommodated 500 sick and bombed-out children. This hospital consisted of 50 well-built brick buildings, with each house featuring a playroom bedroom and bathroom furnished with children's furniture. The report observed, perhaps with a touch of irony, that everywhere there were pictures of Hitler in various poses, ensuring that no child could possibly forget their benefactor. The hospital was hit during the April 1945 RAF bombardment, and although none of the children were killed, nurses reported that some were wounded before they could be evacuated to the underground tunnels. The children were subsequently relocated before American forces captured the Obersalzberg, their ultimate fate unrecorded in the historical record. By 1943, as Allied bombing raids intensified and the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, the vulnerability of the Obersalzberg to air attack became increasingly apparent. The heavy raids on Munich in particular alarmed Martin Bormann and convinced him that even Hitler's mountain sanctuary was no longer safe from Allied bombers. Until that point, Hitler had felt secure at the Berghof, confident that its remoteness and the difficulty of reaching it with bombers operating from bases in England or North Africa provided adequate protection. The destruction visited upon German cities shattered that confidence, and Bormann initiated what would become one of the most ambitious construction projects undertaken during the final years of the war, the creation of an extensive underground tunnel and bunker system beneath the Obersalzberg that would allow the Nazi leadership to continue functioning even if the surface structures were completely destroyed. Construction of the tunnel system began in July 1943 and continued right up until the RAF bombing raid on April 25, 1945. By which time forced labourers had managed to complete 6 kilometres of corridors and 107 rooms carved from the solid rock of the mountain. The work was brutal, dangerous and unceasing. Most of the labourers were Czech and Italian forced workers, though the Italians who worked on the tunnels were not the well-paid specialists who had built the roads earlier, but rather prisoners and conscripted labourers who had no choice in their assignment. Twice during each shift, these men were given a watery soup brought to their place of work in milk churns. To save time and maintain the relentless pace of construction, they were required to take their breaks underground, never seeing daylight during their working hours. The conditions in the tunnels during construction were appalling. The air was thick with rock dust that coated lungs and made breathing difficult. The risk of cave-ins was constant, and the primitive equipment available meant that progress was measured in meters per day rather than the rapid excavation that modern tunneling equipment might have achieved. Some of these forced labourers left their mark on the tunnels in the only way available to them. Graffiti scratched into the walls documented their presence, their suffering, and occasionally their names creating a kind of desperate monument to their experience. These inscriptions are still preserved today, visible reminders of the human cost of the Nazi regime's grand schemes. One particular inscription recorded in the documentation center Obersalzberg's collection reads 2 EMDB AG, PS, DA, 5.5.1945. This was scratched deep into the concrete wall by 3 soldiers recording the Allied victory over the Third Reich for posterity on May 5, 1945, when the first American troops entered the 6-kilometer-long bunker complex. The abbreviations and numbers commemorate that moment when the tunnels which had been deserted by their German defenders were secured without any struggle. The tunnels themselves were far more sophisticated than the simple emergency air raid shelters that had been constructed throughout Germany to protect civilians during bombing raids. Standard shelters typically featured nothing more than benches or bunks for temporary refuge during attacks, with perhaps some basic supplies of water and first aid equipment. The Obersalzberg tunnel system, by contrast, was designed for long-term occupation by the Nazi elite and their essential staff. A US Army report described the complex as a maze of arched connecting tunnels, leading to fully furnished apartments deep within the mountain. All of the major Obersalzberg buildings were connected to this underground network through entrances located either in the basements of the structures or in nearby surface installations. The tunnels served as corridors to spacious underground apartments that were not merely functional, but were designed with a degree of comfort that would have been remarkable in any context, and was particularly striking given the privation and suffering experienced by most Germans during the war's final years. The tunnel system was designed not just as temporary protection from air raids, but as a facility capable of supporting long-term occupation if necessary. Modern amenities were incorporated throughout the complex. Hitler's bunker contained apartments for his staff that were, according to the US Army report, dry, electrically heated and lighted, and comfortably furnished. The tunnel network essentially formed a self-contained underground community with advanced communication facilities that would allow the Nazi leadership to maintain contact with military commanders and government officials throughout Germany and occupied territories. One room was dedicated to telephone operations, featuring a 60-plug local switchboard and a long-distance communication panel, all supported by a network of storage batteries that could maintain operations even if surface power supplies were cut. There were numerous storage rooms, stocked with both essential supplies and luxury items, demonstrating the priorities of those who would shelter there. American troops who explored the tunnels after their capture found hand-painted china vacuum cleaners, furniture wines, and even Christmas tree decorations stored in the underground chambers. Particularly notable was the discovery of a 10-foot telescope lying in its shipping box, apparently intended for astronomical observations or surveillance, but never unpacked and installed. Medical facilities underground were comprehensive and modern. The US Army report highlighted a fully equipped clinic with an operating room and a dental clinic, furnished with brand new equipment, ensuring that the Nazi elite would have access to high-quality medical care, even during extended periods underground. A barbershop was located beneath the SS barracks, adding to the sense that the tunnel system was equipped for every conceivable need and comfort. These facilities stood in stark contrast to the conditions experienced by ordinary Germans, whose access to medical care had become increasingly limited as the war consumed the nation's resources. Hitler's personal library, stored underground for protection, consisted of an extensive collection of approximately 4,000 books. The US Army report noted that most of these volumes focused on art architecture and military history, with works by philosophers such as Kant and political theorists like Machiavelli well represented. The collection notably lacked much in the way of drama or poetry, suggesting Hitler's utilitarian approach to reading and his focus on subjects that related directly to his interests and responsibilities. Close to 4,000 phonograph records were stored nearby, with multiple copies of each recording. Hitler's musical library reflected his well-documented preferences, with records of Wagner and Beethoven dominating the collection. Wagner's opera Tannhäuser was particularly well represented, suggesting it was a personal favourite that Hitler listened to repeatedly. The presence of multiple copies of each recording might seem redundant, but it reflected both Hitler's obsessive nature and a pragmatic recognition that records could be damaged with repeated playing and would need replacement. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, who would become his wife in the final hours before their joint suicide in the Berlin Führerbunker, had her own luxurious apartment within the Obersalzberg tunnel system. According to the US Army report, her underground living quarters featured oak floors and polished cabinets filled with personal items, including books, knitting supplies, and dishes. Her bedroom was furnished with a single bed covered in blue chintz, a dressing table with a three-sided mirror, allowing her to view herself from multiple angles, and closets built into the walls for her extensive wardrobe. The space was designed with a degree of comfort and refinement that would have been remarkable in any wartime bunker, and which demonstrated the priority given to ensuring that those closest to Hitler enjoyed the best possible conditions. The oak floors alone in a facility constructed deep underground during wartime represented a level of luxury that most Germans could only dream of, and the attention to aesthetic details like the chintz bed covering and the three-sided mirror showed that even in an underground bunker, appearances and comfort mattered to the Nazi elite. The underground complex extended well beyond Hitler and Braun's personal quarters. Tunnels connected Hitler's shelter to Göring's bunker, allowing for easy movement between the residences of the two most powerful men in Nazi Germany without ever emerging onto the surface. Additional tunnels connected to the SS barracks, which contained extensive stockpiles of provisions, including, according to the US Army report, bags of rice, wheat, dried peas, and loose ammunition. The juxtaposition of food supplies and ammunition in the same storage areas perfectly captured the siege mentality that characterized the tunnel complex's design. These storage areas and living quarters were heavily fortified with concrete chambers and underground pillboxes equipped with machine gun positions designed to defend the tunnel entrances and the zigzagging corridors that would force any attacking force to expose themselves to defensive fire at multiple points. The construction techniques used in building the tunnels were sophisticated and reflected German engineering expertise, even in the war's desperate final years. The US Army report provided detailed information about the building methods observed in sections of the tunnel system that were still under construction when work was terminated by the April 1945 bombing raid. Construction began by blasting a hole roughly 17 by 20 feet through the mountain rock. The jagged sides of this initial excavation were then reinforced with especially strong concrete to prevent collapse. Inside this concrete shell, 4 inches of brick were laid, followed by a 1/4-inch waterproofing mat, cemented to the surface to prevent moisture seepage from the surrounding rock. An additional 12 inches of brick were added on top of the waterproofing layer, creating substantial walls capable of withstanding significant blast pressure. These brick walls were then finished with a 1/2-inch layer of plaster cement and a thin coat of whitened cement to create an interior surface that was both sanitary and aesthetically acceptable. The floors of the tunnels were equally sophisticated in their construction. A concrete floor, 16 to 18 inches thick, was laid throughout the tunnel system. This floor was not simply placed directly on the rock, but was instead designed to separate the main tunnel from a lower section, specifically designated for pipes and wires, creating a service corridor that allowed for maintenance and upgrades to utilities without disrupting the living and working spaces above. This 2-level design was remarkably forward-thinking and demonstrated an expectation that the tunnel system would be occupied for an extended period, possibly years, and would require ongoing maintenance and modification. Once completed, the main corridor of each tunnel measured approximately 6 by 8 feet, providing adequate space for movement even when carrying supplies or equipment. The tunnels were equipped with vapor-proof electric fixtures, designed to provide reliable lighting while minimizing the risk of explosions from any gas accumulation in the underground spaces. Within a short distance of the finished apartment areas in Hitler's tunnel, further construction into the mountain was ongoing when work was terminated in April 1945. Shafts were being sunk to even lower levels, new tunnels were being driven deeper into the rock, and additional chambers were being carved out. At these locations, American investigators were able to observe the construction methods and materials being used in real time, so to speak, seeing the work frozen at the moment it was abandoned. The incomplete sections provided a kind of cross-section through the construction process, revealing the multiple layers of concrete brick waterproofing and finish materials that went into creating what was intended to be a permanent underground fortress, capable of withstanding even the heaviest aerial bombardment. The extent and sophistication of the tunnel system reflected both the resources the Nazi regime was willing to devote to protecting its leadership and the paranoia that characterized Hitler's final years. While German civilians huddled in inadequate shelters during bombing raids, while soldiers at the front lacked basic supplies, and while the German economy struggled to maintain war production in the face of relentless Allied attacks, forced laborers worked around the clock to create underground palaces for Hitler and his inner circle. The disconnect between the conditions experienced by ordinary Germans and those enjoyed by the Nazi elite, always present to some degree throughout the Third Reich's existence, became absolutely stark in the tunnel system beneath the Obersalzberg. Today, visitors to the Obersalzberg can explore portions of the preserved tunnel system through tours offered by the documentation centre Obersalzberg. Entering through a newly constructed access tunnel, one can walk through areas where emergency generators were meant to power the complex and see machine gun positions now unarmed that once guarded the stairs leading up to the long-demolished Platterhof Hotel. Side tunnels reveal chambers and dead ends where construction stopped in April 1945, work abandoned as the end of the war approached. In one room, a rusted safe that once held Nazi documents lies on its side, its contents long since removed, but its presence a tangible reminder of the bureaucratic apparatus that operated beneath the mountain. The most chilling feature that guides point out is a 30-meter-deep elevator shaft disappearing into darkness. This shaft is rumoured to connect to even deeper SS tunnels that have never been fully explored or documented, evoking both mystery and a certain degree of dread about what else might lie hidden in the mountain's depths. The tunnel system was not merely a protective measure undertaken by cautious leaders. It was part of a larger strategic vision, or perhaps delusion, that characterized Nazi thinking in the war's final phase. There were persistent rumors and some evidence that the Nazi leadership planned to create what was called an Alpine fortress or Alpine redoubt, a network of underground military installations throughout the Alps, from which fanatical SS troops and loyal Wehrmacht units would continue fighting even after Berlin fell and the German heartland was occupied. The Obersalzberg tunnels were intended to be the headquarters for this final resistance, a place where Hitler could direct operations and rally his forces for a last desperate stand. In reality, the Alpine fortress was more propaganda than substance. While some tunnels were started in other locations around Berchtesgaden, including a small system near the village of Winkel that was intended to serve as a military headquarters, most of these projects were never completed. The labour materials and time required were simply not available in 1945 as the German state collapsed. Nevertheless, the fear of an Alpine fortress influenced Allied planning and contributed to the decision to bomb the Obersalzberg in April 1945, even though Hitler was known to be trapped in Berlin. The bombing raid that struck the Obersalzberg on April 25, 1945, was a massive operation involving more than 300 Avro Lancaster bombers from RAF Bomber Command, including aircraft from No. 460 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, supported by approximately 16 de Havilland Mosquito aircraft serving as pathfinders. More than 270 American B-24 Liberator bombers from the United States 8th Air Force simultaneously targeted railway infrastructure around Berchtesgaden, seeking to isolate the area and prevent any movement of troops or supplies. The raid unleashed more than 1,400 tons of explosives on the target area, including 4 massive 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, specialized weapons designed by Barnes-Wallis to penetrate deep underground before detonating, destroying bunker networks through seismic shock rather than direct impact. These earthquake bombs had proven their effectiveness in earlier operations, including the sinking of the German battleship Tirpitz and the destruction of U-boat pens with concrete roofs several meters thick. Flying in clear blue skies Skisen, the bomber crews marveled at the breathtaking beauty of the Alps spread out below them, a spectacular panorama of snow-covered peaks and verdant valleys that seemed almost surreal in its perfection. The peaceful scene was shattered as they approached the target area and unleashed their bomb loads on the Obersalzberg. The results were mixed. Hitler's Berghof was moderately damaged by 3 direct bomb hits, but remained largely intact as a structure, though fires set by retreating SS troops would complete its destruction. The Waffen-SS barracks were heavily damaged and essentially destroyed as functional military facilities. The houses belonging to Hermann Göring, who was the only high-ranking Nazi leader present on the Obersalzberg during the attack, and Martin Bormann were utterly destroyed, reduced to ruins and rubble. The Kelstein house, the Eagle's Nest, sitting atop its mountain peak above the bombing zone, escaped entirely unscathed, its remote location placing it beyond the reach of the attacking force. Most of the approximately 3,000 people in the Obersalzberg area at the time of the attack had taken shelter in the extensive underground tunnel and bunker network. The tunnels performed exactly as designed, protecting their occupants from the bombs falling above. Despite the massive tonnage of explosives dropped on the Obersalzberg, only 31 people were killed in the raid, including several children who had been among those evacuated from German cities to escape Allied bombing. An irony that would not have been lost on those who survived. The tunnel system emerged largely undamaged from the raid, vindicating the enormous investment of resources and labour that had gone into its construction. A testament to the formidable nature of these mountain defences was that of the approximately 2,000 people taking refuge in the bunkers during the attack. The casualty rate was remarkably low, demonstrating that when the Nazi leadership chose to protect itself, it had the resources and expertise to do so effectively. The SS troops who had been responsible for guarding the Obersalzberg complex inflicted more damage in the days following the bombing than the RAF had accomplished. As American and French forces approached from the west, and knowledge spread that the war was effectively over, SS personnel systematically looted the Berghof Göring's villa and other structures, removing anything of value that could be carried away. They then set fire to the remaining buildings to prevent them from falling into Allied hands, with any useful equipment or documentation intact. By the time elements of the US 3rd Infantry Division, the 5th Corps, arrived on May 4, 1945, liberating the area without serious resistance because the SS had fled and scattered earlier, they found the Berghof a burned and empty shell. The first Allied soldiers to enter the underground bunker complex on May 5, 1945, found the tunnels deserted. There was no last stand, no fanatical defense, no dramatic confrontation. The Nazi leadership's underground fortress had been abandoned without a fight, its occupants having fled to uncertain fates in the chaos of Germany's collapse. While the Obersalzberg served as the seat of Nazi power in the Bavarian Alps, the nearby town of Berchtesgaden played a crucial supporting role that was essential to the functioning of Hitler's mountain retreat. This picturesque town, nestled in a valley surrounded by spectacular alpine scenery, had a history stretching back centuries long, predating its association with the Nazi regime. The town featured traditional Bavarian architecture, with buildings sporting the characteristic wooden balconies, painted facades, and steeply pitched roofs designed to shed heavy winter snows. The main square, dominated by a fountain and surrounded by shops and cafes, could have been lifted from a fairy tale, and it was this quality of timeless alpine charm that may have initially attracted Hitler to the region. As the Obersalzberg became increasingly important to the Nazi leadership, Berchtesgaden evolved from a sleepy market town and tourist destination into a vital logistical hub responsible for supplying the extensive facilities on the mountain above. The town's infrastructure was well developed by Bavarian standards, featuring transportation networks that could move goods efficiently from the railway station through the valley and up the winding mountain roads to the Obersalzberg. This logistical system moved everything from basic food supplies and everyday necessities to the luxury items demanded by Hitler and other high-ranking Nazi officials who had established residences in the area. Fresh flowers for the Berghof's many vases arrived daily from greenhouses in the valley. Fine wines and spirits, despite Hitler's personal abstinence, were transported regularly for the entertainment of guests. Specialty foods, including exotic fruits and vegetables that could not be grown locally, even in the Obersalzberg's greenhouses, were procured through Berchtesgaden's commercial networks. The US Army report compiled in May 1945 offered interesting insights into the relationship between Hitler's presence on the mountain and activity in Berchtesgaden below. The report commented on the local townspeople, noting that they were quite certain about when Hitler was on the mountain and when he left, especially during his heyday. This certainty came not from any official announcements, which were deliberately kept vague for security reasons, but from observable patterns of activity. Hitler's visits were almost always preceded by purchasing agents who would descend on Berchtesgaden's shops and markets to buy up every delicacy and nearly all other edible goods in town. This sudden surge in purchasing activity, conducted by men who clearly had unlimited budgets and were unconcerned with prices, signaled to the townspeople that Hitler was either on the mountain or would be arriving shortly. The report continued. His special train would always be standing in the railroad yards in the morning, lying in wait until as secretly as it arrived in the night, it would disappear again, signaling his arrival and departure. But despite the presence of troops, Gestapo and informers, the Grapevine Telegraph never failed to deliver vital local news. This observation captured the reality that security measures, no matter how elaborate, could not completely conceal Hitler's movements from observant locals, who understood the patterns and could read the signs. In addition to supplying material goods, Berchtesgaden played a critical role in providing personnel for the Obersalzberg complex. Many domestic staff members, including cooks, housekeepers and gardeners, were sourced locally, drawn from families who had lived in the area for generations and who knew the mountains and their challenges. Others were transported to Berchtesgaden from other regions of Germany, selected for their skills and loyalty to the regime. This influx of workers substantially increased Berchtesgaden's population and changed the character of the town, bringing in people whose primary allegiance was to the Nazi Party rather than to the traditional Bavarian community. Construction labourers and maintenance workers were also mobilised through Berchtesgaden to work on ongoing projects in the Obersalzberg, including the expansion of underground tunnels and bunkers, and the maintenance of the luxurious living spaces that required constant upkeep. The strategic importance of Berchtesgaden extended beyond its role as a supply depot and labour source. The town itself became a symbol of Nazi power and ambition, attracting pre-war tourists and party members who were eager to visit the area associated with their Führer. Nazi propaganda made much of Berchtesgaden and the Obersalzberg, presenting them as evidence of Germany's natural beauty and Hitler's connection to the German landscape and people. Local resources were utilised extensively to showcase what the regime presented as the cultural superiority and power of Nazi Germany. During the later years of the war, Berchtesgaden's connection to the Nazi leadership made it a potential target for Allied forces, though military planners recognised that the town itself held little strategic value beyond its proximity to the Obersalzberg. When the RAF bombing raid struck the Obersalzberg on April 25, 1945, Berchtesgaden below escaped significant damage. The bombers' focus on the strategic infrastructure of the Obersalzberg, particularly the extensive tunnel systems that Allied intelligence had identified through aerial reconnaissance, resulted in little collateral damage to the town itself. This fortunate outcome allowed Berchtesgaden to retain much of its historical architecture and traditional character, though it would still face significant changes in the post-war period, as it transitioned from a town associated with Nazi power to a symbol of Bavaria's determination to move beyond that dark chapter. The Berchtesgaden Hauptbahnhof, the central railway station, played a particularly significant role in the story of the Obersalzberg and merits special attention. Originally opened in 1888 to serve the growing tourist trade and local transportation needs, the station underwent major expansion and modernization during the Nazi era to accommodate the dramatically increased traffic generated by Hitler's presence on the nearby mountain. The station's transformation reflected both practical necessity and propaganda considerations. It needed to handle not only the increased volume of supplies and personnel flowing to the Obersalzbergs, but also to project an image of power and permanence befitting the Third Reich. The architectural modifications made to the station during the 1930s incorporated the monumental aesthetic favoured by the regime, with imposing facades and spaces designed to impress visitors and reinforce the sense that they were entering a domain of great importance. The station was specifically designed to accommodate Hitler's personal train, the Sonderzug, which was originally named America when completed in August 1939. The choice of this name was curious and has been the subject of speculation. Some historians suggest that Hitler, who harboured a complex mixture of admiration and resentment toward the United States, wanted to pay homage to the European conquest of the Americas and the transformation of a wilderness into a powerful nation. Others believe the name reflected Hitler's fascination with American industrial might and organizational efficiency qualities he sought to replicate in Germany. In January 1943, after the United States had been at war with Germany for more than a year, the train was renamed the Brandenburg, a more appropriately Teutonic designation that avoided the awkwardness of the Führer travelling in a train named for an enemy nation. The Sonderzug was far more than simply a mode of transportation. It was a mobile headquarters, a rolling fortress, and a status symbol that embodied the power and pretensions of the Nazi regime. The train comprised 2 powerful locomotives and between 10 and 16 wagons depending on the journey's requirements, with the total length reaching as much as 430 metres and weighing approximately 1,200 tonnes when fully assembled. The train could travel at speeds between 80 and 120 kilometers per hour, though security protocols often limited actual speeds to lower levels to allow for advanced scouting of the route. The composition of the train was carefully designed to provide Hitler with everything he might need during extended journeys. At both ends of the train were armoured anti-aircraft cars, equipped with flak-Vierling 38 quadruple 20mm cannons capable of firing up to 800 rounds per minute, and engaging targets as high as 2,500 metres, though accounts indicate these weapons never had to be used in Hitler's defence. A communications car contained sophisticated radio equipment capable of maintaining contact with military headquarters throughout Europe, including a powerful 700-watt shortwave radio that could be used while the train was in motion, ensuring Hitler was never out of touch with his commanders. Hitler's personal coach included a conference room where military briefings could be conducted and strategic decisions made, a private office fitted with the latest communications equipment, including a telephone exchange that could connect to any location in German-controlled territory when the train was stationary, and personal quarters featuring a bedroom and a bathroom with a marble tub and gold-plated faucets. One car was dedicated exclusively to bathroom and barber services, offered to Hitler as a gift by the Reichsbahn for his 50th birthday on April 20th, 1939. This particular car was extraordinarily heavy, weighing 78 tons, due to the 5 bathrooms, 3 marble showers, 1 shower room, and the 11,000 litres of water that had to be carried to supply these facilities. Additional cars provided dining facilities for Hitler and his guests, sleeping accommodations for staff, and security personnel quarters for the Reichssicherheitsdienst, personnel who formed Hitler's personal bodyguard. a press car designated for the propaganda ministerium to receive and release official press reports, rather than for accommodating journalists, and baggage cars for transporting the extensive luggage and equipment required for Hitler's entourage. Part of the Berchtesgaden station was set aside exclusively for Hitler's use, providing a reception area where he could meet VIPs in person if he chose, allowing for carefully staged arrivals and departures that could be photographed for propaganda purposes. The town's residents, despite the security measures and the presence of Gestapo informers throughout the area, always seemed to know when Hitler was in residence or travelling. The appearance of the Führersonderzug in the station's special siding, which typically occurred during the night for security reasons, signalled Hitler's presence or imminent arrival to those who paid attention to such matters. The train's subsequent disappearance, again typically under cover of darkness, indicated his departure, and this pattern continued throughout the war years, despite the elaborate security precautions designed to keep Hitler's movements secret. Other prominent Nazi officials maintained their own special trains that regularly used the Berchtesgaden station when travelling to and from the Obersalzberg. Hermann Göring's train, known as Asien, or sometimes Pommern, was equally outfitted for both command functions and personal comfort, reflecting Göring's notorious love of luxury and ostentation. Heinrich Himmler's train, called Sonderzug Heinrich, or sometimes Steiermark, served as a mobile headquarters for the Reichsführer SS as he travelled throughout German-controlled territory, overseeing the vast apparatus of terror and genocide under his command. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, also maintained a special train for his diplomatic travels. These trains represented what might be described as boys playing with expensive toys, senior Nazi officials competing with each other in displays of power and privilege, while ordinary Germans endured increasing hardship as the war ground on. An entrance to a tunnel on the eastern side of the Berchtesgaden railway station remains visible today, though it has been fenced off and is no longer accessible to the public. This tunnel was part of an ambitious Nazi expansion program for a railway line that would have connected Berchtesgaden directly to Salzburg, Austria, just across the border. The project was never completed, abandoned like so many grandiose Nazi infrastructure schemes, when resources became increasingly scarce and priorities shifted to more immediate military needs. During the closing stages of the war, this incomplete tunnel served an unexpected purpose that would provide one of the more dramatic discoveries made by American forces when they captured the area. Hermann Göring, who had personally amassed vast collections of artwork and artifacts through systematic looting of museums, private collections, and Jewish families throughout occupied Europe, sent trainloads of these treasures to various locations as Allied forces closed in from all sides. His primary repository was Berg-Weldenstein near Nuremberg, where he had constructed a bunker specifically to house his most important and valuable acquisitions. On April 21, 1945, with Berlin under siege and the end clearly approaching, Göring departed from Carinhall, his expansive estate located 60 kilometers northeast of Berlin, which he had named after his deceased first wife, Karin von Kantzow. He travelled in his special train Asien to Berchtesgaden, bringing with him additional artworks and valuables he was desperate to preserve from the advancing Soviet forces, who were known to be systematically stripping German territory of anything of value. It was in the incomplete railway tunnel on the eastern side of the Berchtesgaden station that Göring hid his train, presumably believing that the incomplete status of the tunnel would make it less obvious as a hiding place than completed rail facilities that would certainly be examined by the Americans. The train sat there camouflaged and guarded by a handful of loyal personnel until American troops discovered it several weeks later. When US forces finally entered the tunnel and forced open the sealed rail cars, they found themselves staring at one of the greatest concentrations of looted art treasures discovered anywhere in Europe. Paintings by old masters, sculptures, jewellery, gold and silver objects, rare books and manuscripts, furniture, tapestries and countless other items filled car after car. The collection represented decades of systematic theft from across occupied Europe, the cultural heritage of entire nations packed into railway cars and hidden beneath a mountain in Bavaria. The recovery of these items and their eventual return to their rightful owners or their countries of origin would take years and in some cases decades, with some pieces remaining in dispute even today. The Berchtesgaden Hauptbahnhof remains operational today and continues to serve as a gateway for tourists visiting the region, though its character and purpose have changed dramatically from its wartime role. The station has retained much of its historical architecture from the Nazi expansion period, though modern amenities have been added to accommodate contemporary travellers. A Burger King restaurant now occupies space where Nazi officials once waited for their trains, an ironic juxtaposition of American commerce and German history that would have been unimaginable to those who designed and used the facility during the Third Reich. On the west side of the station, a large mosaic from the Nazi era remains visible, though the swastika that originally formed part of the design was carefully chiseled off in the post-war period, leaving a conspicuous gap in the decorative pattern that serves as its own form of historical marker. Other clues to the station's Nazi past can be found in the remaining ironwork and architectural details for those who know what to look for and understand the building's history. Hitler's personal entrance to the station still exists, though it is largely indistinguishable to casual visitors unfamiliar with the building's historical significance. The space has been repurposed for mundane functions, and nothing marks it as having once been reserved exclusively for the use of Adolf Hitler. This anonymity is a deliberate part of the post-war German approach to dealing with Nazi-era structures that involves neither glorification nor complete erasure, but rather a kind of functional integration that acknowledges history while refusing to celebrate it. The station's size remains somewhat anomalous for the town it serves. Berchtesgaden is not a major population centre, and the volume of rail traffic today hardly justifies such an expansive facility. The station seems ridiculously large when considered purely in terms of its current function, but its oversized character makes perfect sense when understood in the context of its role during the Nazi period as the primary gateway to Hitler's mountain retreat and the Obersalzberg complex. Following the war, the entire Obersalzberg area underwent dramatic transformations as successive waves of post-war planning and development altered the mountainside yet again. The US Army occupied the area from 1945 until 1995, a presence that lasted exactly 50 years, and saw the site serve multiple purposes as American priorities and policies evolved. Some Nazi-era structures were demolished immediately or within a few years of war's end, while others were repaired, repurposed or rebuilt to serve the needs of the occupation forces. The Platterhof, which had been heavily damaged in the April 1945 bombing, was not demolished, but was instead rebuilt and expanded by the US Army Corps of Engineers beginning in 1952. Renamed the General Walker Hotel, after General Walton Walker, who had commanded the Sixth Corps during World War II, and later died in a jeep accident in Korea in 1950, the facility became a recreation center for American military personnel and their families stationed in Europe. For 4 decades, thousands of American service members and their families enjoyed vacations at the General Walker Hotel, taking advantage of the spectacular alpine scenery, hiking and skiing opportunities, and the novelty of staying in what had been Hitler's mountain sanctuary. A ski lift was installed to provide easy access to mountain slopes, and a golf course was constructed on land where SS troops had once drilled and Nazi officials had walked. The ironic transformation of Hitler's restricted area into an American recreation facility represented a particular kind of victory, a demonstration that the Nazi vision for the Obersalzberg had been completely supplanted by democratic values and peaceful pursuits. However, by the 1990s, the General Walker Hotel had fallen into disrepair. Decades of use and insufficient maintenance funding had left the structure deteriorating and increasingly unsafe. The decision was made not to invest in extensive renovations, and the hotel was finally demolished in 2001, removing one of the last substantial Nazi-era structures from the Obersalzberg. The space where the SS barracks and parade ground once stood has been covered by the expansive grounds of the Kempinski Hotel Berchtesgaden, a modern luxury hotel that opened in 2005. The hotel's construction required extensive archaeological surveys and documentation, as the site contained numerous artifacts and structural remains from the Nazi period. These findings were carefully catalogued, and many were transferred to the Documentation Center Obersalzberg for preservation and display. The Kempinski represents yet another transformation of the Obersalzberg landscape, this time into a high-end tourist destination that attracts visitors from around the world who come for the natural beauty of the region while remaining largely unaware that they are walking on ground that once held such dark significance. The Kelstein House, the Eagle's Nest, remains the most intact Nazi-era structure in the entire Obersalzberg area. Having escaped damage during the April 1945 bombing due to its elevated position above the target area and its solid stone construction, the building survived the war completely intact. Unlike the Berghof and other structures that were deliberately demolished to prevent them from becoming neo-Nazi shrines, the Eagle's Nest was deemed acceptable for preservation because Hitler himself had rarely visited it, and it was not closely associated with his personal life or with major policy decisions. The building was converted into a restaurant and tourist attraction accessible by a specially maintained road that winds up the mountain, and then by the original tunnel and brass-lined elevator that rises through the rock to the structure itself. The Eagle's Nest has become one of Bavaria's most popular tourist destinations, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors annually who come to experience the spectacular views from the terrace and to contemplate the strange juxtaposition of natural beauty and historical horror that the site represents. The Documentation Center, Obersalzberg, which opened on October 20th, 1999, represents the most recent and perhaps most important transformation of the site. Built on the foundation of Hitler's former guest house, the center provides comprehensive information about the Nazi era, the role of the Obersalzberg as a seat of power, and the broader history of National Socialism. The exhibits make no attempt to sensationalize or glorify the Nazi period, but instead focus on education and historical understanding. Visitors can examine documents, photographs, and artifacts that illuminate how the Nazi regime functioned, how it made decisions, and how those decisions led to catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. The center emphasizes the direct connection between the idyllic mountain setting and the monstrous policies planned there, confronting visitors with the uncomfortable reality that some of history's greatest crimes were conceived in surroundings of natural beauty by people who appreciated art music and comfortable living. The Documentation Center also provides access to portions of the preserved tunnel system, allowing visitors to walk through the underground corridors where Nazi officials sheltered during air raids and where thousands of forced laborers suffered and died during construction. These tunnel tours have become one of the most powerful educational experiences available at the site, as the physical environment makes tangible the scale and nature of the Nazi regime's priorities and methods. Walking through passages that were carved by enslaved workers who received only watery soup twice per shift, seeing the graffiti they scratched into walls to document their presence, and then emerging into the sections where Hitler and his inner circle enjoyed comfortable apartments with oak floors and heated rooms, creates a visceral understanding of the regime's brutal hierarchies that no amount of abstract description can match. The contrast between the natural beauty of the Berchtesgaden area and its historical associations with the Nazi regime remains one of the most striking aspects of visiting the region today. The spectacular alpine scenery with snow-capped peaks rising above forested slopes, cascading waterfalls and pristine mountain lakes seems fundamentally at odds with the knowledge of what transpired here during the Third Reich's years of power. Visitors walking through Berchtesgaden's charming town centre, with its traditional architecture and friendly shops and cafes, might easily forget the town's wartime role as the logistical center supporting Hitler's mountain retreat, if not for the information panel's historical markers and the presence of the documentation center serving as constant reminders. This tension between appearance and reality, between the beauty of the setting and the darkness of its history, forces visitors to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the ease with which civilized societies can embrace barbarism. The fact that Hitler loved the Obersalzberg, that he spent approximately 1/3 of his time as Führer in this place, and that he found peace and inspiration in these mountains, while simultaneously ordering the murder of millions, challenges simple narratives about monsters and their lairs. The Obersalzberg was not a dark and foreboding fortress, but rather a place of sunshine and flowers, where children played and families lived, where music was performed and art was displayed, and where people enjoyed the simple pleasures of mountain life. That such a place could also be where the Holocaust was planned and where strategies for wars of aggression were developed serves as a powerful reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs, and that the capacity for monstrous acts exists alongside appreciation for beauty and culture. The preservation and interpretation of the Obersalzberg as a historical site reflects broader German approaches to confronting the Nazi past, approaches that have evolved significantly over the decades since the war's end. In the immediate post-war period, the dominant impulse was to erase physical reminders of the Nazi regime, to demolish structures and remove symbols in an attempt to make a clean break with the recent past. The 1952 demolition of the Berghof exemplified this approach, driven by genuine concerns that the building might become a gathering place for neo-Nazis, and by a widespread desire among Germans to move forward, rather than constantly confront reminders of their national shame. However, over time, German society came to recognize that erasure was not the same as confrontation, and that avoiding the past was not the same as learning from it. The decision to establish the documentation center Obersalzberg in the late 1990s represented a mature acknowledgement that historical sites, even difficult and painful ones, serve important educational functions, and that preservation, when done thoughtfully and with proper historical context, is preferable to erasure. The approach taken at Obersalzberg today seeks to balance several competing considerations. The site must be preserved and made accessible for educational purposes, while simultaneously being prevented from becoming a destination for Nazi sympathizers or a place where the regime is glorified rather than condemned. The exhibits must be comprehensive and historically accurate, while avoiding sensationalism or excessive focus on the personalities of Nazi leaders rather than on their crimes and victims. The natural beauty of the setting must be acknowledged, while ensuring that aesthetic appreciation does not obscure or diminish understanding of the historical realities. The local community's desire to move beyond the Nazi association and establish an identity based on other aspects of the region's history and character must be respected, while ensuring that historical memory is not lost or sanitized for the sake of tourism. These are not simple challenges, and the solutions implemented at Obersalzberg represent ongoing negotiations between these various imperatives. The town of Berchtesgaden itself has largely succeeded in establishing an identity independent of its Nazi associations, becoming known primarily as a gateway to outdoor recreation in the Bavarian Alps, and as a center for traditional Bavarian culture. The town hosts annual festivals, celebrating local traditions, maintains museums dedicated to local history and salt mining heritage that predates the Nazi period by centuries, and promotes itself as a family-friendly destination for hiking, skiing, and nature appreciation. Many visitors to Berchtesgaden today are unaware of the town's wartime role, or choose not to engage with that aspect of its history, focusing instead on the area's natural attractions and cultural offerings. This ability to move beyond a traumatic past, while still acknowledging it when appropriate, represents a kind of success, demonstrating that places like people can be defined by more than their worst moments. For those who do engage with the historical dimensions of Berchtesgaden and the Obersalzberg, the experience can be profound and unsettling in ways that visits to more obviously memorial sites, like concentration camps or battlefields, are not. There is something particularly disturbing about learning that some of history's greatest crimes were planned and authorized in a place that looks like a postcard illustration of alpine beauty, that the men responsible for those crimes lived comfortable lives surrounded by art and music and natural splendor, and that they saw no contradiction between their aesthetic sensibilities and their monstrous policies. The Obersalzberg forces a confrontation with the banality of evil in ways that more overtly horrific sites do not, challenging visitors to recognize that perpetrators of mass atrocity are not always obviously monstrous figures, but can be people who love their dogs, appreciate classical music, admire beautiful landscapes, and live seemingly normal lives while simultaneously ordering acts of unspeakable cruelty. The underground tunnel system in particular serves as a powerful metaphor for the hidden nature of Nazi crimes. Above ground, the Obersalzberg presented an image of cultured refinement and peaceful mountain living. Below ground, in tunnels carved by enslaved workers who suffered and died in appalling conditions, the reality of the regime's priorities and methods was starkly apparent. This duality between surface appearance and underlying reality characterized the entire Nazi regime, which presented itself to the German people and the world as a force for order, culture, and national renewal, while simultaneously implementing policies of systematic murder, slavery, and conquest. The preserved tunnels at Obersalzberg make this duality tangible, allowing visitors to literally move between the comfortable living quarters of the Nazi elite and the rough-hewn passages where workers labored and died. The experience of visiting Obersalzberg today is carefully designed to be educational rather than entertaining, somber rather than sensational. The documentation center's exhibits avoid graphic images of Nazi atrocities, while still conveying the scale and nature of the crimes committed by the regime. The focus is on understanding how the Nazi system functioned, how decisions were made, and how those decisions connected to outcomes. Visitors are encouraged to think critically about the nature of totalitarianism, the dangers of unchecked power, and the responsibility of individuals within systems that commit atrocities. The tunnel tours emphasize the human cost of Nazi construction projects and the brutal conditions endured by forced laborers, while also documenting the luxurious accommodations enjoyed by those who exploited that labor. Throughout the site, the message is clear. This beautiful mountain was the setting for terrible crimes, and understanding that history is essential to preventing similar tragedies in the future. The final impression left by a visit to Obersalzberg is one of profound contradiction. The natural beauty of the setting has not diminished in the decades since the war's end. The mountains still rise majestically above the valley, the air is still pure and invigorating, the views are still breathtaking. Yet knowing what transpired here, understanding that Hitler spent roughly a third of his time as Führer in these mountains, recognizing that the Holocaust and World War II were planned and directed, in part from these slopes, fundamentally changes how one experiences the landscape. The beauty remains, but it is now inseparable from the knowledge of the darkness it once sheltered. This inseparability is perhaps the most important lesson the Obersalzberg has to offer. That beauty and horror can coexist, that appreciation for art and culture provides no immunity against barbarism, and that vigilance against evil requires constant effort rather than comfortable assumptions about human nature. The legacy of Hitler's Berghof, the Obersalzberg complex, and Berchtesgaden extends far beyond the physical remnants that survive today. These places serve as reminders of a historical catastrophe that claimed tens of millions of lives, destroyed countless families and communities, and left scars that remain visible generations later. They stand as warnings about the dangers of totalitarianism, the seductive nature of power, and the ease with which ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary crimes. They challenge comfortable narratives about good and evil, forcing recognition that monsters can appreciate beauty and that great crimes can be planned in settings of great natural splendor. They demonstrate the importance of historical memory and the necessity of confronting difficult truths rather than erasing or sanitizing them for the sake of convenience or comfort. The transformation of the Obersalzberg from Nazi power center to American recreation facility to educational site reflects broader changes in how societies deal with difficult historical legacies. The journey from attempted erasure in the 1950s to thoughtful preservation and interpretation in the 1990s and beyond represents a maturation in historical consciousness and a recognition that confronting the past honestly, no matter how painful, is preferable to avoiding it. The Documentation Center Obersalzberg, the preserved tunnel sections, and the careful interpretation provided to visitors all serve the essential function of ensuring that the crimes planned and authorized in this beautiful place are neither forgotten nor repeated. For those who make the journey to Berchtesgaden and climb the mountain to the Obersalzberg, the experience is meant to be educational and sobering, a reminder of what humanity is capable of at its worst, and why vigilance, historical memory, and moral courage remain essential in every generation.